This is the Bama Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today, we take a tour through the history of contextual criticism that surrounds the Gospel of John, and we look at the unique styles and attributes of John's writing.
Yeah, and I think I'm just going to use a text we recommended at the beginning of our John series, Brent, to kind of guide our way. It was kind of my favorite text of all the prep work that I did. It's by Dr. Gary M. Burge, and it is called Interpreting the Gospel of John, the second edition, a practical guide. And I like this source. I was getting ready. I wanted to kind of like at the end of our study with John, I wanted to kind of do like a high level. Let's just kind of circle back around and appreciate some conversations from the 10,000 foot level. And so I pulled out all my resources one last time just to make sure. And I just thought this book did such a good job talking about things and summarizing things in such helpful ways. And really, I'm only going to be using the first part. So there's 3 parts to this book. I'm just going to be focusing on part 1, which, let's see, what are they? Part 1 he calls, he has a title here, Before You Begin. So it's kind of like all the background stuff. Part 2 is kind of like how to do research. And really, it's just how to do any research. If you're a grad student in particular, I feel like it was almost written for like, I wonder sometimes if he gives it to his grad students and says, here, read this. It's going to help your experience in grad school. And then the last part of the book is about how to preach and teach responsibly out of the Gospel of John. So I am just going to work on part 1, the first 4 chapters. And kind of similar to how we used that other book, Understanding the Jewish Roots of Christianity, that book. I'm just going to kind of use it as my guide for conversation. But Dr. Burge has written all kinds of sources we found out on John, right, Brent?
Yeah, he's got there's like this giant NIV application commentary series that is written by a whole host of people, but Dr. Burge does the entries on the Book of John as well as the letters of John. I didn't see one on Revelation, so I don't know who's doing Revelation, but he's at least got those 2 things going on.
I love it. If we get lucky, we're working on trying to arrange an interview with him that we can have after these couple episodes and talk to the man himself, the scholar himself, and see what kind of fun we can have with that conversation. So we'll see if we can get him over here to join us.
Yeah, we are going to take this episode and the next episode to cover these first 4 chapters of his book, which he mentions he requires his students to go over these first 4 chapters, like his beginner students go over these first 4 chapters before they ever look at the actual gospel together. So this is like his foundational stuff. Here's what you need to know before you dive in. So that's what we're going to, we did mention at the beginning of the series, maybe we should have done this.
Well, actually,
whole thing at the beginning, but
yeah,
it's hard to say.
And I'm going to circle back around to that idea, I think today before we're done, but maybe tomorrow or maybe in our next episode. I'm not sure, but I took the opposite approach, and I'll kind of talk about why. But yeah, I think that's very, very interesting. Totally understand that. I'm gonna flip it and do it backwards like we did. But maybe we'll chat about that.
Yes. Potential discussion fodder if we get Dr. Burge on the podcast.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. We're taking notes already. We got a Google Doc running right now, Brent, with all of our questions we keep coming up with for a potential interview. Let's say we dive right in. You ready, Brent?
I'm ready.
Sweet. All right. Chapter 1 of his book, titled History of Interpretation. He just kind of goes over like, historically speaking, what has the popular consensus been regarding John, and how has that opinion evolved? And so he starts even with a whole section on just like the early period, really almost like the first 1,500 years of church history, and basically says John was pretty consistently kind of regarded as the gospel of the highest honor. Of the 4 gospels, it was kind of the most honored gospel for a good long time, over a millennia, and was seen by most as the gospel with the most value historically by the church. And then we bump up against the Enlightenment. And he has a section on each of these things that you could just go deeper in if you wanted to get your own book. But the Enlightenment, and he's referring specifically, he says, to 18th, 19th centuries in Europe. So if you were to think session 5, this is going to be the world that kind of births and then comes out of the French Revolution, like right in the middle of this Enlightenment period in Europe. You have this post-Christian world being birthed out of the French Revolution. And so everybody starts asking, this is the rise of textual criticism. This is the rise of people asking critical questions about the Bible and generally being driven by I don't want to say an anti-Bible bias, but like a questioning of the supernatural, a rejection of inspiration, and at this point, we're not dealing with the rise of liberalism as we would know it, but this is going to be the age of textual critical scholarship that begins to arise, where we start to go, maybe maybe supernatural things didn't happen. So that's in the Enlightenment, everything shifts away from John being the gospel of highest honor and most value. And in the Enlightenment, everything shifts to the synoptics are the ones that have historical value. But John is no longer seen at that point in history as being your historical record. That's no longer the case. And so that really continues until early 20th century. And then all of a sudden we start to have this awareness of the Jewishness of the gospel. Let's see, what do we got here? 1924. He talks about a Jewish scholar by the name of Abrahams. Let's see if I can find the actual. What was the name? Israel Abrahams. That's a very Jewish name, if I do say so myself. It's about as Jewish as you can get.
You really can't do any more than that, I don't think.
In 1924, this is a quote. In 1924, Israel Abrahams, a rabbinic scholar at Cambridge and an Orthodox Jew, addressed stunning news to the University of Theological Society, to the university's theological society. Here's his quote. Abraham said, "To us Jews, the fourth gospel is the most Jewish of the four." And which was stunning to the status quo. Even today, like a lot of people read John and just a cursory reading, if you don't ask a whole lot of deeper questions, if you don't pull apart, like we spend a lot of time in our podcast, Brent, pulling apart the word Edoi, and what does that refer to? The Judeans, the Jewish leaders, the Jews. If you just read it on the surface, it feels like a very anti-Jewish gospel. Like it can almost be seen even today as like the most anti-Semitic of the four gospels. But this scholar suggested 1924, the most Jewish of the four. And really when you look beyond some of those surface things, you notice you don't have to get much below the surface at all to really notice a whole lot of other elements that are very, very Jewish. And so everybody had looked at John up to that point, and they had noticed the super Hellenistic influences. We talked about that in our Session 3 podcast. We talked about it throughout our study here. And they said not just Hellenistic, but most scholars in the Enlightenment period said Gnostic. So not only Hellenistic, not just Greek influence, but Gnostic Greek influence. And so their conclusion was the author of John is not the Apostle John, but is a later, probably 2nd century, they thought, Greek Gnostic thinker. But Abrahams showed that the discussion was not Gnostic, but distinctly Jewish. Now, from there arose a conversation, maybe it's a Hellenized Judaism, which I think begins to start to turn towards and face and work really well with what we're suggesting throughout all of our studies of John. But this was the first kind of turn. So it went from, 1600 years of John as like the greatest gospel to all of a sudden John is the least historic, like the least historical gospel, the least historically reliable gospel, the most Greek, the most Gnostic, to all of a sudden in the earliest 20th century, the conversation shifting towards maybe this is deeply Jewish and maybe a Hellenized Judaism, but that's how the conversation begins to shift and to change.
I do wonder on the point of the Enlightenment. I mean, if it's tagged around the French Revolution, that is late 18th century. So maybe this is a little bit of a stretch, but like the early 1600s, late 1500s is really when you're starting to get the Bible in the common language of the people. And so
that's a great point.
By this Enlightenment period, that's kind of the first time in history where everyone you've grown up with has had access to the Bible in their own language, generally speaking. Like, obviously, it's different in different parts of the world, but we are talking about Europe. So does it have anything to do with, this more common understanding of the scriptures, this more familiarity that, the common people have, or is this shift in thinking entirely academic and it wouldn't really have mattered because they're all studying it in Greek and Latin and whatever anyway?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to probably just to talk about that would say it's largely academic. Although that academic conversation is truly, as you point out, widening and blowing up to a much wider, as universities begin to multiply and sprout and scholasticism takes root and evolve, that conversation is getting wider at a really fast pace. I would still call it academic, but it is definitely the fruit, and I love you pointing that out. I wouldn't have thought to point it out, but the printing press, the Reformation, getting the Bible in the hands of the masses, this is the fruit of we've now sat with the Bible and looked at it and asked questions and studied it and cared about it, for a century and a half. And now the fruit of that conversation is a new discussion born out of these questions simply because we got the Bible in the hands of more people. And that is a beautiful thing, even though it led to some conclusions that I would call suspect. But the ongoing, evolving conversation, beautiful. And
right,
I find that inspiring. So the traditional understanding at this same part of history, so early 20th century, 1920s, before that, after that, right in that period, give or take a few decades, the traditional understanding was that the synoptics, and when we say synoptics, remind our listeners what we're talking about, Brent, before I say that word another 100 times.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are the three gospels that seem to work together. They harmonize easily, John being the outlier. So the synoptics, everybody assumed the synoptics were dependent on source material. What we mean by that is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their gospels based on source material that was compiled outside of the gospel itself. So there were stories, there was teaching. You'll often hear the academic community talk about source Q, and there were all of these teachings that apparently the early church had in some form, and those are what were used to construct your gospels, particularly the synoptics. And so everybody assumed the synoptics were dependent on some kind of Christian community source material, but John was not, which led to many people thinking, well, John essentially invented, like the reason why John's gospel is so different, it's not a synoptic, is because, again, earlier they thought some Greek Gnostic author kind of created these very Christian teachings based on the, theology of Jesus. Or maybe it was John, but John wasn't using source material. John was kind of creating, inventing, writing from scratch his own gospel. That was the traditional understanding. And then in 1957, Dr. Burge is going to talk about a scholar by the name of Robinson. What's the name here? John A.T. Robinson. He was at Trinity College in Cambridge, and he was doing some work. Let's see. He did a paper that was he read it at Oxford University, and in that he described what he called a new look. That there was an old look, these traditional understandings. There was an old look, an old understanding, an old wineskin, if you will, of the Gospel of John. And he was saying there's a new look, there's a new paradigm, there's a new way to look at the Gospel of John and the data that we have. And so in it, he had 5 things that Dr. Burge outlines here in this chapter. 5 things in this new look. Let me just give you the quote here. In it, he described an old look on John that was under siege. The old look consisted of 5 major propositions. So this describes the old look. Number 1, John is dependent on sources, in particular, the synoptics. So John is toying off of the synoptics. The synoptics were toying off of sources. Number 2, John's background is different from that of its subjects. The author was Greek, writing with significant Gnostic influence. This is the old look. Number 3, the old look, John is not a serious witness to the Jesus of history. Number 4, the old look says that John shows evidence of a late first century theological development. So this doesn't represent early first century. It doesn't represent the theology of Jesus. It represents a more evolved late first century theology. And then 5, the author of the 4th gospel is not the Apostle John or even an eyewitness. He says, this is the old look. This is what people have kind of assumed. These are 5 assumptions from the old world. But Robinson was saying we now have to see all 5 of these elements radically differently, and he made his case. So he started a whole new conversation. Then in 1963, which, by the way, if we just pause for a moment, I know that for some of our listeners, this isn't all that exciting or intriguing. I freaking love this stuff. Like, I could just study textual criticism all day long because I find it so it gets my creative juices firing. Like, I love to have somebody, oh gosh, somebody asked that question. Oh, that's a really great point. And I hardly ever agree with where they land with the question, but the question itself just gets my creative brain flowing. And I love textual criticism for that. People sometimes think I love textual criticism because I agree with all of it. I think I hardly ever do, but I love to study it because of how it helps me think critically about the Bible.
And maybe even to clarify on one of those old look points, the idea that the theology in John is a late first century development. That is more or less when we suppose the Gospel of John was written down and recorded for the first time. But we're saying that's when it was actually written down, but it reflects Jesus's actual theology, versus what they're saying is it was written at the same time. I think everybody more or less agrees on when it was first written, but they're saying that the theology within it comes from that later period and not from Jesus.
That's right. And I can't wait for our next episode. So I'm just gonna put a pin in it.
Okay.
But these 5 points, by the way, if you're able to engage textual criticism without freaking out and losing your breakfast, you can see how all 5 of these old look points make sense. If you were paying attention to our study on John, John is dependent on sources, particularly the synoptics. Maybe not. Let's go to the other 4. John's background is different than that of his subjects. I mean, John was radically different, wasn't it, Brent? You feel like?
Yeah, the writing, of course, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, how can Matthew, Mark, and Luke be so similar and John be so different? John is not a serious witness to the Jesus of history. I mean, when you think about the gospel, you're like, well, it just seemed on the surface less historical. Seems more artistic. John shows evidence of late first century theological development. The theology of John is packaged radically different than the theology of the synoptic. I can understand why that was the old look. The author of the 4th gospel is not the Apostle John or even an eyewitness. If all these other things, you can look at those 5 and go, that's not crazy. Those people aren't crazy. Those make sense. But I love what Robinson said. I think there's more. And that led to an evolution of the academic conversation. And so in 1963, you had another scholar by the name of Dodd, and he suggested, kind of based off of this new theological conversation, this new, historical academic conversation, he starts suggesting that there was actually independent source material for John. And this whole conversation is what we might describe, what Dr. Burge might describe in his first chapter here as the new look at the Gospel of John. And so we actually have a diagram, Brent, from the book. We're going to credit that in the show notes. Post it there. Give credit to the book. It's on page 21. I think you're probably going to be able to see it in your chapter art. But you have here a diagram kind of reflecting the historical tradition in John. So what they have here, if you see over there, you have John's gospel, and the old look basically suggested that John's gospel was completely dependent on basically Mark, Matthew, Luke. But this new look says, I think we got multiple things at play. And so if you look at this diagram, you've got like the sources, the stories about Jesus. Now, if we believe that John was an eyewitness, the actual John, son of Zebedee, which I do, the book here isn't making those hard and fast conclusions. It's representing the whole conversation. But if we would assume that, obviously these are stories that John remembers personally. I'm not suggesting anything else. But we also seem to get the impression that these gospel writers didn't just go to their own memory, but they also went back to other sources, people, stories, traditions, and they asked the Christian community, what was that story? What happened? Do you remember any of those stories, Brent, where when you read it, you're like, wait, was like John hiding in the bushes? Like we talked about how Chosen has them like sitting outside the door when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, if you remember, because somehow you got to have like, how does John figure out where to write this stuff down? Well, part of it is the source material he's using. So you can see the source material there. You can see that the diagram shows Hellenistic stories with a question mark. Now, if you listen to me, you know that I don't think there's a question mark there. I think John is absolutely, without a doubt, employing Hellenistic stories. And he's taking the early collections, early collection sources like source Q, as maybe the academic community might talk about it. He's using that. And then this graph has Mark, because scholarly general consensus is that Mark was written first, then Matthew, then Luke. You've heard me say I disagree. I think Matthew was written first. And then, so I would swap in this diagram Matthew and Mark. I would also keep a question mark that I would assume is gone, but I don't know if we know for certain that John is toying off of Matthew's record and Matthew's gospel. I do think I would remove the question marks in that diagram, but that diagram's super helpful to see this is not what they were assuming in the Enlightenment. They were assuming that John was almost independently making up his gospel, inventing his gospel with the help of the synoptics with no other source material. But the new look says, no, I think we absolutely have source material at play, and we will probably get into that in our next episode. So I found that diagram super helpful. And then he closes off chapter 1 with a discussion about current trends. So what is modern day 21st century scholarship saying about John? He has how many points does he have here? He has a handful of points. Number one trend we have already seen. This is current 21st century, modern, right now, today scholarship. One trend we've seen, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has sparked a renewed interest in the Jewish background of the fourth gospel. Love that. Number 2, the second area of development has to do with historical location. If it's true that we may locate the fourth gospel in a Jewish context, considering that this context experienced sharp disruption in the Jewish War of AD 70, scholars have expressed genuine openness to an early setting for the gospel. What you were just referencing a moment ago, Brent. I love that. Point number 3, a compelling interest among many Johannine scholars today is the quest to unravel the literary structure of the fourth gospel and its sources. We'll get into that a little bit today and even more in our next episode. What's the literary structure? What's the literary structure of John? Number 4, if there was a Johannine history or process within which the fourth gospel evolved, there is also an interest today in reconstructing the social realities presupposed by the gospel. So what is the historical context? And you can get a real appreciation for how the challenge of and rigor of the academic quest, because Bema has the luxury of just smashing all this stuff together into a trendy little podcast and putting it out there in a form that we love. But the academic world has to, any one of these questions is a huge undertaking to really, and the beauty of the internet and the world we live in is that Marty or anybody else just gets to take these things and these beautiful discoveries and these wonderful studies and put them all together and package them in a way that's palatable. But Man, what a thing. Number 5, many scholars in the field do not ask questions, at least primarily, about the history of the text, the state of the Johannine community, John's historical trustworthiness, or sources. Rather, they ask how to make sense of the text as it stands. Above all, the sense of the text is determined as a reader interacts with the story. For some, this is known as the rhetorical analysis of the gospel. And then finally, 2 more. Number 6, for about 10 years, the discipline of biblical studies has been looking at the relationship of the New Testament to the ideological aims of the Roman Empire. So what is the relationship between John's gospel and Rome's gospel, in essence? Shalom and empire, we might say. Number 7, the question of the fundamental historicity in the 4th gospel will never disappear, and discussions are always ongoing. So that chapter 1 was just kind of a brief overview. What has our understanding of John been over the last 2,000 years? And that was chapter 1. Before we move on, Brent, any thoughts or anything about chapter 1?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this diagram about, what if John has all these potential sources, like maybe he's looking at the completed gospels of any of the other 3 writers. Maybe he's looking at their early collection of stories that have been compiled by whoever. Maybe he's thinking of the stories originally. And I wonder if it's the kind of situation where, the disciples are sitting around together and, Matthew's sharing some ideas that he's putting together for his gospel. And then, somebody random like Bartholomew is like, oh man, that reminds me of that time that Jesus put the mud on that dude's eyes. You remember that? That was crazy. And John's like, oh yeah, that was awesome. I remember that. And everyone's like, oh, we forgot about that when we were putting our gospel together. I'm not really sure where that would fit. And John's like, well, I'm going to make sure that goes in mine. Like maybe it's something like that where, there's just, as John said, there's so many stories. If you told all of them, there's not enough room. Like all of these guys have to make selections about what happened. They have 3 years of stories that they have to condense down into these gospel accounts. And, they're each taking their own flavor to it. And John's like, well, there's so many other stories. I got to figure out how to fit some of these in there. And that's, I kind of feel like John was probably there for, most of those. Maybe there's some that he wasn't around for to some extent or another, but he at least probably heard about them at the campfire that night, stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know. The idea of how much did John actually eyewitness? How much did he just hear about later that day? How much did he, maybe he was sent to go to town to do something and something happened while he was gone. Like there's so many different dynamics there to what his level of eyewitness would be.
Yeah, I think those are amazingly great questions and so fun to think about. I'm fascinated with some of the theories that some of my teachers' teachers have formulated about the construction of the synoptics. Maybe there's a place someday, sometime where we can talk about that. We have a couple listeners here that have been very helpful. Shout out to David Kopp and just the things he's been able to connect me to. There's some incredible theories with the construction of what we would call the synoptics that fascinate me. I'm not going to get off on that. I'm trying to focus on John here. But when you think about how those conversations and the construction of these gospel accounts come into being as we have them and know them today, there are some fascinating questions. And I know that I'm just kind of a sucker. I'm such a chosen fanboy for so many of these things. But in season 2, where they depict John, remember how it opens and closes with John writing his gospel? Do you remember that, Brent?
Oh, yeah.
And he's got Mary there and he's talking to, I love that because he's interviewing with intention. He's interviewing the disciples. We know that Matthew's making his account, brilliantly done by the chosen. But I love how they depict John, and he's obviously talking to the disciples, but extend that picture, that image, that mental, painting, extend that to other eyewitnesses. And what if he went to places where stories happened and found the woman that experience the healing and talk to that person whose son it was, the officials, talk to the official's son. And like, if he went back and had those conversations, this really starts to take, like, I don't want to over dramatize it, but you can really feel how this can be real, like real. And I like the mental exercise there.
Well, and just the depiction, and we talked about this in our episode, but the depiction of John sitting on the stairs, listening in on the conversation with Nicodemus, it's like, man, if I was in John's position, you better believe I'd be sitting on those stairs listening in at what Jesus is saying. Like,
I mean, it's true.
Like,
it's true.
Every opportunity I'm going to be listening to, I'm just going to be soaking in every word of Jesus. So, it just, whether or not he was actually there for that conversation, or maybe talked to Nicodemus later, whatever it is, like, I just feel like if John had that opportunity, he's going to be listening in.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, yep. It's a great example of something that feels a little fanciful to me, but you're absolutely right. Like, there's a ton of reason to think about the probability that would be the case more often than not. I totally agree with you. Oh, let's see here. All right, let's keep going, or else we're going to have a super long episode. So chapter 2, I'm not even going to dive into. It's basically a chapter on, who wrote the Gospel of John, the debate about authorship. Is it this John? Is it that John? Is it not a John? Is it a community, an early church community? And does a really great job. Really, you got these three main theories that drive the conversation. Is it John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle? Is it the early church community in the name of John? Maybe even a group of John disciples that they call the Johannine community. Like, people talk about the school of John. Like, there was this understanding that John had a unique style, a unique teaching, and he passed it on to others, and they're the ones that wrote the Gospel of John. So not John himself, but a community. And then, or finally, that earlier idea that's no longer, I think Dr. Burge calls it in vogue, this idea that it's some later Greek Gnostic 2nd century author. Not too many people are talking about that anymore these days. But those are kind of your three options. John, the early church community, or some later Gnostic author. Obviously, I'm going to lean to option 1, maybe with some influence of option 2. I want to talk, if we get a chance to talk to Dr. Burge, I want to talk to him about the possibility of that, which might be a bridge too far for some of our listeners. It's not for me. It doesn't affect my views on inspiration at all, but it may for others. So you're welcome to disagree with that. But nevertheless,
I mean, it's clear in Paul's writings that Paul often has somebody else doing the actual writing for him, and then he, writes his greeting in his own hand. But like, the idea that other, like, disciples of John would be doing the actual writing as John is compiling these stories, and obviously I think what they're saying in those theories is more than that sometimes, but even the idea that John
for sure
himself didn't write it, I don't think is that much of a stretch for most people.
No, that wouldn't be a stretch. I think that number 2 theory certainly presupposes the absence of John, the death of John, and you have a community putting that together without his involvement. Typically is what the academic option number 2 is putting forth. But I like to make it a little mushy and wonder if the two don't go together. But we'll see if we get the chance to talk to Dr. Burge about that and get his opinion. I'll get into that in the next episode a little bit. You'll hear some of my personal unlicensed leanings, like I have no right to say this conviction type stuff because I'm no scholar, but you'll hear some of my own musings in the next episode. But I wanted to skip chapter 3. That's what I want to do next episode, is just focus on chapter 3. Chapter 4, the last of the part 1 of Dr. Burge's book here, talks about John's style. What is the style of the Gospel of John? And so he opens up just with a section talking about, just things that are unique to John, unique to his writing. And you have to be able to recognize this stuff, and maybe Jesus did have these tics and say things exactly like this, and yet maybe this is also just the way that John likes to write. In John, Jesus always uses the double amen. Amen, amen. Truly, truly, I say to you. Jesus addresses his audience as children. And John does that in his other letters. Dear children, always talks to people as children. Narratives are often continued using therefore or thus as a word, a transition word that John loves to use in a unique way that's not present in the synoptics. Just has a whole list of things. He has actually 10 items there that he goes through. Things that are just unique, styles that are unique to John. But then there are these other things about John's style. I think I would call them motifs. And by that, I don't mean motifs in like, we talked about in session 3, Brent, we talked about, and I don't know if we want to link that in the show notes or not, but we talked about content motifs. Like we talked about the temple motif, the third temple motif in John. We talked about the scapegoat motif in John. We talked about the 7 signs and a new creation and a tomb in a garden. And we talked about like what I would call content motifs of content. But Dr. Birch here points out like stylistic motifs in how he writes. He talks about the motif of misunderstandings. He identifies 7 of them. The Samaritan woman misunderstands Jesus' reference to living water. The disciples do not understand what Jesus means by food. The crowd misunderstands what Jesus means by bread from heaven. The Jewish leaders are confused and misunderstand about Jesus' origin in Bethlehem or Galilee. Jesus' opponents misunderstand the discussion of Abraham in chapter 8. The disciples think Jesus believes that Lazarus has only fallen asleep in there's a motif of, here's what Jesus is saying, but here's what people think he's saying. Misunderstanding. He has a motif of ironies. I kind of like this one. Let's see here. Ironies. Within John's story, I'm reading right now. Within John's story, it isn't just that the actors misunderstand Jesus, but there's a peculiar ironic aspect to what's happening. In fact, some scholars wonder if the entire message of this gospel is ironic. The Word of God, who created the world, is rejected by the very world he made. Moreover, this world succeeds in killing him. He is lifted up on the cross, but we know that a deeper reality is at work. Jesus' death is his glorification, in which God's deeper purposes are worked out. That crucifixion is described as glorification, is perhaps one of John's deepest ironies. This is more than just misunderstanding. This lets us see that something more profound is happening than anyone expects, and that there are those who are confused can even be left not only in the dark, but also stumbling foolishly. I thought that was really well written. And so Dr. Birch identifies 12 different, he always picks very Jewish numbers, by the way. He identifies 12 different ironies. He has a list of those. He talks about another motif being what he calls the asides, like the kind of the parenthetical comments. Let's see, I'll give you a quote here. Therefore, we as readers can easily get the impression that John is on our side. He's telling a story, but at the same time, he's aware that we are there. We are his allies. He is like the director of a great drama who stands out on the sidelines, coaching our understanding. In fact, we are more informed than the apostles when we read this gospel because John is slipping us notes. John is coaching us. A little bit later, he says this. John is coaching us, making sure we understand. The Synoptic Gospels do this too, like Mark 7:3. We're given a quick explanation about purity, hand washing. However, John has elevated this to a level that the Synoptics do not have. There's a motif of hierarchies of meaning, and I really like this point. I had never really noticed this until I read his book here, but he pointed out in John 6, there's like, and he describes it in his diagrams like a staircase. Like you start off with this basic understand, like a basic meaning, but then there's a greater meaning, followed by a greater meaning, followed by a greater meaning, and finally an even greater, like you build meaning upon meaning. So he does this in John 6, which is what I feel like Josh's 2-part journey in his amazing 2 episodes that he did. Like, that's what Josh was leading us on was, okay, there's this, but it's also more than that. And so there's that, but it's also more than that. And he's taking them even deeper than that. And then he's taking them even deeper than that. And I feel like Josh tapped into that really well. So way to go, Josh Basse. Yeah. And so he just kind of diagrams those things out. And then finally, he talks about one final motif being the hidden glimpses of Christ. The hidden glimpses of Christ. Above all, John wants to coach us into belief. And so he has hidden in his story elements of Jesus' identity that no one in the story can fathom. I call this the invisible Christology of the Gospel of John. In reality, John has presented me, these are quotes, by the way. In reality, John has presented me with an experience parallel to that of the actors on stage. I am confronted with revelation that I barely understand. I am coached on some things, such as the use of stone jars and the name of seas, and I'm left alone in others. John suspends me, leaving many of the most profound answers in abeyance. Did I say that word right? Abeyance? Abeyance. I love it when authors use words I'm not familiar with.
Abeyance, I think.
Yeah. Love it. Anyway, those are just some cool little snippets that I pulled out. But yeah, and again, and next episode will be even more this way. I wanted to wait. Well, I'm gonna get into this a little bit on the next episode. But like you pointed out earlier, Brent, he gives this to his students to read before they study John. I wanted to wait until afterwards because I just wanted to hear the text, think about the text. I didn't want all the jumbled up, well, what if this was this and it'll get even crazier in the next episode. But I wanted to be able to just hear John, and then after I've heard John, okay, now consider these things and then go back. And that's how I prefer to interact with textual criticism, because I feel like if I start with textual criticism, I don't know. It's probably my fundamentalism impacting. There's still some fundamentalism in my roots, Brent, and I feel like I always want to start with my inspired text, do everything I can there, and then keep asking great questions. And not be afraid to change and grow and shape my understanding and take new positions and learn new things. I think the fundamentalist in me, unapologetically, I don't feel bad for it. I always want to start with just kind of the text alone and then start to learn and shape from there. I think that's why and I say that out loud because sometimes when you talk textual criticism, I know there are some of our listeners that get nervous. And so I like to let them know, yeah, me too a little. But hopefully we do it in a way that can be trusted and safe and good. And yeah, I want to be somebody that can be trusted with textual criticism. So there you go. What do you think?
I think that's a good idea. I think I don't know if this is a good analogy. I'm thinking of this on the fly, but the idea of grasping the text and then opening your hand up and depending on how you say this, it sounds really bad, but seeing where the wind takes it. And it's yep. That sounds pretty bad.
Yep.
But also wind means spirit. And
yeah,
are you tuned into the Holy Spirit? Are you open to God revealing truth to you in some way, maybe that you didn't see it? And then, you see where that takes you, but then you take grasp of it again. And so you're never letting go of the text forever, but you're never holding it so tight that you can never be inspired by God and shown new things. I don't know if that's a great analogy or not, but
no, Brent, I actually really love that, because in the world of fundamentalism that I was raised in, I feel like there's just this pure objectivity to the text, but it's kind of immature, uninformed. So it's just pure objectivity. It's grasping the text and just white knuckling even harder and harder and harder onto the text. But then textual criticism seems to take this enlightened, educated, now we know even more, but it just seems to get even more objective, even more distant, even more cold. And I like to use textual criticism in a way that opens me up so that Jesus can keep so it takes that grasp, where I started, rooted in something good and authoritative and inspired, but probably misunderstood, probably incomplete, probably immature. And then I love your image of opening my hands, learning new things, seeing not what the scholars, not what the smart people want to tell me, but what the Spirit wants to tell me. But not purely subjectively, informed by objective, historically rooted good stuff. I like my technical language here, but I like that. I like that image of like grasping, but opening my hands, letting it be shaped, grasping and putting away some more and opening my hands again, both with this objectivity and subjectivity to it. Like objectivity in that it's rooted in something real and not just my feelings or my thoughts or what I think, but something objective, but also open to what the Spirit is doing and what Jesus is revealing to me and saying to me and telling me and working through others. And I really like that. I'm probably going to steal that.
Well, if that's what you want to call it, sure, you can steal it. Okay, well, let's close up this episode, I guess, and then we'll be back for some more discussion.
Some more discussion. I'm kind of excited. Probably won't be a long episode next time, but I'm kind of excited about the goodies in the next one.
Oh, famous last words.
Always.
All right, well, if you want to get a hold of Marty, you can find him on Twitter at Marty Solomon. I'm at EIBCB. Check out this book, Interpreting the Gospel of John by Dr. Burge. It's not a difficult read. It's something, if you didn't pick it up at the beginning and you made it all the way through John and you're just like, oh man, I'm sad that John's over. Like, get this book, go through it, and then dive back into John again on your own. Like, yeah, if we're doing this analogy, like grasp the text and then let go for a moment and then come back and grasp it again. Like, don't let this be the end of the story of the Gospel of John for you. Like, go back. Anyway, you can find more details about the show at BamaDiscipleship.com. So thanks for joining us on the Bama Podcast. We will talk to you again soon.